And there we go. All right, Jonathan, are you there? I can see a
Hi, yes, I'm
smile.
looking for my headphones.
There you go. I'm going to turn your video on too so we can see your lips move. Well, anyway, welcome to you guys. I don't know how many more people will be joining us, but before we dive into content, let me ask you this. How are you doing so far? I mean, actually, two questions. Overall, what's your experience been of trying to do all of this online so far, now that we're in our second semester of doing this? And how are you doing so far in this course? Any questions, any concerns, anything I can clarify for you before we dive into more content? Alicia, we'll start with you because you're next to me on the screen.
I haven't done any online classes in a while, but it to me, it doesn't seem much different, but
Okay. All
so
right.
far, so good.
So far, so good? Okay. Had you done any before, or is this your first time? Did you
I've
say?
done just regular online classes before,
Okay.
pre-pandemic.
Wait, right. There's the pre-pandemic online classes, and then there's this.
Yeah.
Okay, how about you? What's your experience been?
Well, I've never done online classes before the pandemic, so this is kind of new to me because before the pandemic, I was in high school. So, but
Good point. So what a way to start your college career.
excuse me, I can't hear you for some reason.
Hello, check test. All right.
That's better.
Okay. Yeah, as I say, what a way to start your college career, coming into it this way. Observations. What do you think? Was it working for you? I mean, are there things we could do to make it work better?
I mean, with what we're given, it's pretty much as good as it can be. I mean, I really don't have any issues with online classes. It's just I would, of course, rather be in person.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the only thing that is good about online classes is I don't have to drive to school every day. So
There's always the bright side. Yeah, good point. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, from what I've seen so far, I feel like I'm just like an in-class learner. I do better in the classroom, and I never thought I'd say it, but I really miss being in the classroom. I have trouble organizing sometimes and getting I'm taking 5 classes right now and getting just staying organized with all of it, making sure all the due dates, everything's turned in on time, and just kind of prioritizing well. And I learned that the first semester I kind of struggled once we switched to online. But yeah, I mean, right now, I've gotten better. I've learned from my mistakes last semester and just trying to be better this semester.
Fair. Actually, what concerns me personally is that I'm getting used to this, and I don't want to.
Yeah.
I really don't want to get used to this. I suspect that there's a possibility that we might be back in person in the fall. I used to be really confident about that, but I guess a lot depends on how quickly the vaccines roll out and what the criteria is. I mean, in theory, if we were all vaccinated and could prove that by the time we got to the end of the summer, I could see no reason for not being in person again. But then again, every time I think, no, there can't possibly be one more stumbling block that they're going to throw in our path, one seems to materialize. So I'm getting a little, like a dog that's been beaten with a newspaper, I'm starting to get a little shy, you know? I'm curious, again, we'll hop off this topic in a second, but since I've got you here, and it's only 3 of you, so it's not like we have huge numbers of people to get through. Your level of confidence, if let's say the vaccines are in process and we know as much as we can possibly know about COVID, you have the option come September. You can be live again, back in the classroom just like before, or you can continue to do this. What would your preference be, do you think? Alicia, what do you think?
For me, where I work at a school full time, so honestly, the online aspect of it's better for me right now. But I wouldn't be against doing an in-person class.
So you don't think you'd feel any extra anxiety about getting back in a
Not really. I'm already in a school,
so right, if you're going to get it, you're going to get it, right? Exactly. Yeah. Okay. What about you? How confident would you be to get back together face to face?
Well, actually, last semester I had a few classes that were in person. So, I mean, I'm pretty much all right with it. Uh, Everybody has to wear masks anyway, so
Mhm.
I'd feel pretty safe with it.
Okay. Jonathan, what do you think?
I agree, but I'm not in any rush either. If you know, I'm okay right now where things are at.
Okay. All right, fair enough. Well, the one thing that really becomes that's really a victim, a casualty of doing not only online learning, but this asynchronous online learning with really which requires no human contact at all except in the written word, is we don't really have an opportunity in this class in particular to have real-time discussions of what's going on in the political world, because this topic, as I think I mentioned in my opening video, is unique in the sense that it changes while you study it. Yes, there is the history of the American political process, and that's relatively static, although interpretations of that history change all the time. But the American political process itself is not cast in stone. It changes based on societal forces, based on political forces, based on all kinds of things, current events, COVID-19, just to name one. And the ability to have that conversation in real time and connect what you're seeing around you to what hopefully you're learning as you march through the content is something that I really hoped we could use this forum to do. So that's, and by the way, there is a forum, there's a written forum in the online class where we can do that, although I think so far only one person has availed themselves of the opportunity. It's not really the best way to do it. So I'm just curious, a lot has gone on even since you registered for this course. I began teaching it at the beginning of, not the beginning, I guess in the middle of the Trump era. And we never were at a loss for things to talk about because has been such an interesting and unique time. So as you look around you, you consume the sources of news that are available to you, none of which are particularly good, by the way, but you consume what's out there. What is your chief concern? What's the thing you look at and go, well, I don't really understand that, or that concerns me, or I wish I knew more? Or am I even getting accurate information? Alicia, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I watch a lot of news. I don't dig too much into anything else, but of course, like anyone else, we're exposed to a lot through social media, and you can't help but wonder if the things you hear, of course, the negative things you hear, if there's any truth to them. No matter which side you fall on, you're faced with what other people say. So when you hear conspiracy theories or anything along those lines, of course you don't want to be in support of that, so you wonder if there's any truth to it. So
of course, the other problem with almost all news sources, I don't even say almost anymore, all news sources. Let me just make a blanket statement right up front. There is no news source that exists in the United States today, either via network news, be it the traditional broadcast networks, cable, social media, internet. I mean, none of it can be objectively trusted anymore. And that's a really frightening thing to say, because it wasn't that many years ago when, all right, these media sources had a bias in this direction, these media sources had a bit of a bias in that direction, but they were still attempting to present news. It wasn't advocacy. And today, with the possible exception of C-SPAN, which is just raw stuff coming out of Washington, everything is advocacy. I mean everything. So how a representative republic continues to operate in the absence of any source of accurate information really is confounding. I mean, not that media has ever been purely objective. News media has been advocating since the beginning of the printing press, but it's getting harder and harder to sort through the emotion and the hysteria and actually come up with a reasonable and reasoned approach. What do you think? What are your observations about the state of our political process today?
Well, usually, when talking about news, I try to listen to all news outlets because you're, of course, going to find news outlets that say something that others don't and where they differ. So I usually don't just pick like the Republican news outlets or the liberal news outlets, I usually listen to all of them because it explains everything in greater detail. And especially with just coming out of high school and having a bunch of friends from different cultures and races and stuff like that, you want to make sure you have the best info that you can go off of to know how to interact with them, to not possibly offend them, or to be able to have just debates with them normally.
Possible to have normal debates with people today?
It can be rough because you don't want to say something that might offend them, but usually when I'm with my friends, we all know that our our goal isn't to offend anybody. It's to ask questions and just talk out everything within our group because we're all different. We come from different areas. So
Sometimes I wonder, and I don't really have any reliable data to convince me either way. I wonder if the country is as emotionally overwrought and divided as social media and all media would have us believe, or are we being manipulated by the extremes? In other words, are we really one thing or the other? Does everyone have to pick a side and be on it and then simply defend that side against all reason? Are we really that polarized? Or is it that certain news outlets, all news outlets, and all social media profits from that? The more agitated we are, the more we click on stuff, the more revenue they make. I don't know. I have no answer. I just wonder, because I hear people like yourself, and I've encountered other students in this course over the last couple of years who seem like reasonable people. They can look at both sides. Their friends apparently are the same way. And so I don't see this hyperbolic division when I look at real people. I don't know. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
So, like I said in my discussion board, I really don't know much about, like, I never really got into like the government or anything or politics. I'm still learning, and I'm hearing, like, I'm on listening to the news and just hearing what people have to say. I'm really open to everything, just listening. And I mean, I kind of get a basis of everything, like, but I'm still kind of like, I don't know, and I'm willing to listen. I can't always believe everything I hear too. That's what I'm trying to learn. I'm learning that. Like, I hear one thing, I kind of just, I don't want to just agree with that. I want to just keep, hearing new information, and because new information is always coming up. So it's just, I don't know. I'm still learning, still figuring everything out.
Good. And by the way, that's a great observation. And here's one thing that's true. And I hope that this class is a first step for you guys in that direction. The more you know, the more you truly understand about the Constitution, what this country was originally designed to be, the more you know about that. Oh, we have someone else coming in. Hang on. There we go. Welcome. And I will, and I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce your name until you tell me how it's pronounced, because I'm going to screw it up. I've been reading it, but I've not heard it said. Okay, turn your audio on. Let us see your face and join in. Or not. Okay, well, I guess sometimes passive viewing is okay. Anyway, the more you know about, there we are. Hello.
Hello.
There you are. Tell me how to pronounce your name properly so I don't screw it up.
It's Naija, but everybody calls me Naya because it is kind of hard to say.
Naya, okay. I just didn't want to say it wrong, so thank you for that. Yeah, and so my point then is the more you know about the way things are supposed to be, the less manipulatable you will be. And when you do get into political conversations with family or friends, you can do it in a reasoned way and call people back to what we were originally supposed to be in the first place. So here's what I want to do with the rest of the time we have left today. I want to go through some of the stuff you've already covered about the Constitution and about where the Constitution came from. I'll make a bold statement and tell you this. The reason I put the entire text of the Constitution out there for you is the answers to almost every controversy, believe it or not, can be found in that relatively short document. And the sad thing is, the vast majority of Americans know very little. They know very little about where it came from. They know very little about what's in it, and that, in many cases, is the cause of our deep confusion and some of our deep division. So I'm going to do a screen share here for a second, and I'm going to go over a few basic concepts, and then I'm going to open it back up to discussion, because that's what this live stuff should be about. You know, based on the material that you've seen so far, that our form of government, the Constitution under which we live, was heavily influenced by Enlightenment era philosophers. Now, for those of you who haven't studied much philosophy, the Enlightenment era, which essentially extended from the end of the 1500s to the beginning of the 1700s, or actually to the middle of the 1700s, was really historically unprecedented. In that, you had people, educated, learned people, primarily in the West, in Europe, begin to question some things that had been considered unquestionable truths. And the kinds of things that these people were writing and thinking back in the 1600s literally could have gotten them thrown in jail or killed, and in some cases did. And it was these ideas, which we today take completely for granted, that forms the basis of the country that we live in. And one of the things that makes me the saddest is how few people understand just how special and unique this is, even today. So here's a couple of them. Here's one guy, Charles de Montesquieu. He comes along and says, back in the 1600s, that you shouldn't combine power in the government. You shouldn't have a legislative, an executive group, or a judicial group. They shouldn't be one and the same. You have to have separation, because it's in that separation, it's in that balance of power that you prevent tyranny. All right? Then along comes this guy, Thomas Hobbes. He said something that nearly got him killed, because he actually questioned the divine right of the king to rule, by which I mean the king rules because God said the king rules, and if you question it, then you're not only committing treason, you're committing heresy. All right? So to come out and say that, you know, the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasted by which he's able to protect them, which means it's a deal. We've actually made a bargain, all right? You're the sovereign, and we'll recognize you as such because you protect us. You maintain civil order. And as soon as you can't do that anymore, we can get rid of you. That was a really scary thing. And of course, then along comes this guy, who finally put it all in a nutshell. All human beings possess natural rights to life, liberty, property, and conscience, which can neither be granted nor taken away by a king or a government. Now, why is that so revolutionary? Because even in England, when King John signed the Magna Carta, where he essentially had to back off and say to the nobles, all right, you know, you're right, I'm not all powerful, I've got to grant you guys some rights. It was clear that it was he, the king, granting those rights. It wasn't that these rights existed, he was giving them to people. Locke comes along and says, king can't give anything. Because the king, it's not the king's to give. It's not the government's to give. It's yours by virtue of the fact that you're human. Now, those who are religious believers would say, well, yes, because those rights come to you from God. Locke, being an enlightened philosopher, wasn't necessarily religious, but he just put it this way. Because you're human, because you are a human being and you're born with these rights. You're born with a right to your own life. You're born with a right to be free. You're born with a right to own property, and you're born with a right to make decisions based on your conscience. That's yours. So now the only proper function of a government or a king or anybody that's in power is to protect those rights. And if these rights aren't being protected, then the government is no longer legitimate, which brings us to a second quote, revolt is the right of the people, meaning at any time when the deal is broken, when the government stops holding up its end of the bargain, the people have a right to get rid of the government, which, of course, if you do it all the time, can be a pretty scary, unsettled way to live. But that's fundamentally what Locke said. And these were the ideas that were behind and gave moral justification to the colonists here in the beginning in the 1740s and 50s to begin to resist what they saw as tyranny from the King of England, King George. It wasn't that they saw themselves as being less British subjects. They still considered themselves to be British subjects and were proud to be. What they wanted was the same rights as all other British subjects had. But when they began to perceive that it wasn't just Parliament, but it was in fact the king himself who had decided that he was going to take away their rights. He was going to take away the rights of trial by jury, for example. He was going to take away property rights and take away the rights of the colonies to legislate themselves and to impose taxes. And people said, no, he's basically broken the deal. So revolt is now our right. And that, of course, is what's behind the Declaration of Independence. And many of these ideas, these Enlightenment ideas, are deeply enshrined in the Constitution. Here's a couple of them, all right? This idea of checks and balances, to get back to Montesquieu. No one branch of the government is superior. The executive is not superior to the legislative. The legislative is not superior to the executive, nor is the judiciary. They all share power. Now, that's both a good thing, and it's also confusing, because it's often not clear who does rule in certain cases. In fact, it's always been a characteristic of our government that the different branches compete one among the other. And in theory, what should happen is the two branches of the legislature, where you've got the Senate where the states are represented, and you've got the House of Representatives where the people as a whole based on population are represented, that they typically would be in the lead with the executive acting as a check on them and the Supreme Court acting as a check on the executive. But of course, it's not nearly that neat and tidy. All right? So we just talked about that. The other thing that's a bit confounding in our system is this idea of federalism. And this was, as you know from what you've read, this was one of the big compromises in the ratification of the Constitution to begin with. The states saw themselves as sovereign. They saw themselves literally as having all the rights and prerogatives of an independent country. And our first attempt at writing under the Articles of Confederation was really no more than a treaty among independent countries. We couldn't get anything done that way. And so the Union is in danger of falling apart. So the next approach, which is what's enshrined in the Constitution, which is a representative republic, has a balance between the two. Some rights, some prerogatives still reside with the states. Others reside with the central government, and that's what's called federalism. And we're continually renegotiating it. You know, it's interesting. COVID brought about a very interesting phenomenon. Many of us, myself included, has sort of been bemoaning for years that increasingly states were losing more and more of their prerogatives to the central government, and that really state governments were becoming less and less relevant and needed to find a way to take some of that power back. Well, what we found out is when COVID came along, that there were all kinds of abilities for governors to declare emergencies, to maintain emergencies ad infinitum, and that your experience of COVID really depended upon where you lived. If you lived in the Northeast states that were typically run by liberal Democratic governors, you found your life far more controlled than if you lived in a place like Nebraska or Texas or Florida, where the governors were more conservative and less likely to use executive orders. So maybe the states have more power than we thought they did, and maybe more power than they even should. So here are the big ideas. Number one, as I mentioned, this idea of balancing representation based on population, meaning we the people, with individual state sovereignty with the states. That was a huge compromise. It was the Connecticut plan, as you know, from your deep reading on the topic. Another great idea, much as it is maligned, is the Electoral College. Now, right, you may say, how can you like the Electoral College? Isn't that a silly throwback to a bygone era when people, lived when there was no infrastructure and people couldn't go to the polls? No, actually, the Electoral College, the genius behind it, and believe me, it was one of the most difficult things that the framers put together, was to come up with a way that would prevent the executive from always being elected by the most populous states in the country, by the most populous parts of the country. Because the framers understood that if only the populous states elected the executive and effectively permanently disenfranchised the rest of the country, it wouldn't take long before the rest of the country rebelled. So this was an attempt to keep the Union together. In today's world, if we did away with the Electoral College, essentially every president would be elected by New York and California, to put it simply, because that's where a majority of the population resides, and the rest of the nation, for all intents and purposes, has no say in that. And even within states, you know, for example, if you're a Republican who lives in Delaware, it's very likely that your vote for president is ever going to much count, because the population centers in Delaware tend to be more liberal, and they're in Newcastle County. So even within states, you've got that problem. But if you had that problem nationwide, you really could potentially do harm to the Union. So the framers said any successful candidate for the executive role is going to have to appeal both to the less populous parts of the country and the more populous parts of the country. That's going to create more of a bipartisan support. What a good idea is having a Supreme Court in the first place. Initially, we didn't think we were going to need one. Little to realize that if you have a constant competition between the legislative and the executive, someone's got to be the referee. And what they use as a standard, of course, is the Constitution itself. The Bill of Rights. Again, we take them for granted today. James Madison didn't think we should have a Bill of Rights initially, because his fear was if we enumerate in the Bill of Rights is going to be assumed that it doesn't exist. He thought it was sufficient to say whatever the Constitution doesn't say is the prerogative of government is the prerogative of the people. But some states wouldn't ratify without it. So we have enshrined these ideas of the right of worship, the right to free assembly, the right to free speech, the right to self-defense, and on and on. Many of which, again, citing COVID, it's been controversial because some have pushed back on government lockdowns as saying, yes, I know that this is an emergency, yet you've just unilaterally taken away several of my rights that are guaranteed in the Constitution without any due process. Interesting conversation. And finally, the American presidency. Now, why is that such a big idea? First of all, no office like it had ever existed before the framers came up with it. It was essentially modeled after George Washington, who was at the Constitutional Convention. I mean, he was, even before the first election was held, everyone knew Washington was going to be the first executive. I mean, he was the general that had kept the troops together, and he was being called the father of the country even before we had a country, per se. So they knew that Washington, who was presiding over the convention, was going to be in this role. So to a point, they sort of tiptoed around it. They didn't want to say anything to offend Washington, but they essentially modeled the office on his character. And that's something to remember, because Washington was not imperious. He wasn't dictatorial. In fact, he was very concerned about that. He was very concerned that the office didn't have that much power, that its powers were prescribed by the other branches. Also, it was not at all clear in that day and age that once someone assumed executive power, that they would ever relinquish it, right? Kings didn't voluntarily step down. If you wanted to get rid of a king, you had to kill the king. So this idea that we had a system where at some point, an executive, a president, would just voluntarily hand over the reins of power, that was really a revolutionary idea. It was a concept that their mid-1700s European brains had a hard time trusting. And in fact, when Washington did voluntarily leave the office after his second term, it was considered a bit of a miracle, and it became the standard that every president followed up until Franklin Roosevelt, who stayed in there for 4 terms, and until there was a constitutional amendment that prevented that. But here's the thing that I want you to really realize about the American presidency. And it's hard to think this when you look around at the world that we live in. It should not matter that damn much who's in the office. It shouldn't. It was never designed to matter that much. The president, the executive, was essentially designed to execute the will of the legislative. And he or she had certain other powers to appoint a cabinet and to deal with foreign governments. But this idea that the president would ever be this cult of personality, that the president would be this all-powerful figure, would have been foreign to the framers of the Constitution. The other thing that would have been foreign to the framers of the Constitution, and Washington in particular warned of it, was this idea of faction. Now, of course, today we take faction for granted, meaning parties, political parties. We take it for granted because we've had political parties really since the 1800s. But in the 1700s, it wasn't at all clear to people like Madison and Hamilton and Washington and Franklin, it wasn't at all clear to them that a representative republic could even survive if there were factions, if there were sides. In other words, if we weren't all in this together as citizens, could this system work? Well, it has, at least up until now. Not so confident now as I would have been even a few years ago. But that's something to keep in mind when you look at what's going on around you, is we take all of this fighting and this polarization for granted. It's not what the framers intended at all. So there are some eternal questions that surround the Constitution, which we're not going to get into any of these today, but we will. First of all, do states have a right to leave the Union? We would have thought that the Civil War would have settled that, but in point of fact, certain states only ratified because they thought they had the right to leave the Union. Others of the framers, like Madison, said, well, if you have the right to leave, then the Union doesn't really work very much. So that's something that constitutional scholars can argue over. What's the proper balance between honoring the original intent of the framers and making it a court-worthy document? Meaning, can you make it up as you go along? Or should you honor the original intent unless it's amended by the process that's in the Constitution itself to amend it? And will there come a time, have we even maybe already reached that time, then we need to go back to the drawing board? Should we, in fact, have another constitutional convention and get the best and the brightest together and see what we can do? When I did this class live, we had group projects. And so I think the second or third semester I taught this class came up with a really novel idea, which is, yes, we should, in fact, have another constitutional convention, except it should be, if you are a lawyer or a politician, you can't attend. It would only be open to citizens elected by their peers who were neither in political office nor had a law degree. I found that a fascinating idea. Okay, finally, we know what's going on today. What's going on today is, what's going on this week and for the next couple of weeks has never happened before in the history of the country. And that is that the House of Representatives has impeached, which means indicts, right? It doesn't mean convicted, it just means indicts, has indicted a president who's not in office for the high crime misdemeanor of insurrection, in their words. And the Senate is going to be asked to essentially hold a trial on whether or not to expel someone from office who's already left office. It makes your constitutional head hurt because it's got so much complexity to it. So this is the news that we're observing. So I'm going to get out of screen share here, if I can find the button. All right. I can't quite see the button to stop it. Oh, well. Yeah, let me try escape. Ah, there we go. That's better. There we go. So, the question to you guys. You see what's been going on. You see what's happened here just in the last couple of weeks since the election. What are your observations as citizens? What are your thoughts? Alicia?
Well, on the impeachment itself, if it weren't for the fact that in doing so would keep him from being elected again, then I would say let's let it go and put our efforts towards just getting past where we are now.
Except there's nothing in the Constitution which says that he couldn't run again.
Okay, so maybe that's part of the news bias part of it, but
there you are. There's been this assumption, so that, and by the way, it's dead on arrival. We know now, based on the vote taken yesterday, that there's no way that they're going to get 67 senators to vote to convict. So even before the trial starts, we know the outcome, just as we knew the outcome when this happened a year ago. And we'll do it anyway. So that's what's it, because the framers of the Constitution designed impeachment to be very rare, to be very hard to do, and they left it vague, right? You need 2/3 of the Senate to convict someone of what they call high crimes and misdemeanors. That's almost contradictory. It almost sounds like, well, a high crime is what, like a felony? A misdemeanor is what, like not paying a parking ticket? The two things, essentially what they're saying is use your own, they were saying to future generations, we're not going to tell you what to do. In other words, you'll know it when you see it, right? But they intended it to be very rare. They intended it to be something that would be very difficult. Now, we had only seen 2 impeachments in the history of the country up until we got to this very recent past, right? Richard Nixon, for all of his troubles in Watergate, was never actually tried, right? So now we have a situation where we've seen 2 impeachments in less than a year. And my concern is this is going to become a political weapon. And there have already been articles introduced to impeach Joe Biden, which you knew was going to happen. Not what the framers intended. I don't know. What do you think? What are your observations?
Well, I agree with you on the point where I think impeachment at some point, it's already starting to become a political weapon, in my opinion. I feel like it's been used way too often and as a threat against Trump. I mean, the first one was warranted. I can understand where somebody would say, oh, he deserves that. But this second one, when he's already out of office, I feel like it's just a waste of time and resources because there's not really, I mean, now that we've learned that there's nothing in the Constitution that keeps him from running again, I don't see any reason to keep going with it. I mean, Joe Biden's already won. Joe Biden's the president now, and Trump is gone. So I don't see any real reason to waste the time on it.
My guess is that even if he was convicted, and let's say that he was, he's not going to be, but if he was, and he chose to run again in a few years, there may be court seats. It might even go to the Supreme Court. I mean, there could be challenges that he shouldn't be able to run, but that would be a really difficult case to prove. So I suspect you're probably right. Nigel, what do you think?
I think that as far as like the impeachment and everything,
Just your observations of what's going on. And
well, I think that like I agree with him. Like Biden did win and it is over, but I feel like if he didn't get impeached and he was to win again, the same things would happen.
mm-hmm.
So I feel like the impeachment, it was necessary in a way, but if he was to come back and change some things, it would be like,
Mm-hmm.
certain things I didn't like. A lot of people didn't agree with, which is why he got impeached.
Mm-hmm.
But if he did come back and he did change the impeachment, like I don't know, it should be like.
Yes, it can be confusing to sort through. There are many who feel like you do, that the impeachment is almost a necessary process to go through, right? Although some have said, well, the Constitution provides the opportunity to censure, which essentially is a formal reprimand without going through the trial. But that's not the direction that we chose to go in. The Democrats chose to go in. But I think your opinions probably are representative of many Americans. They don't necessarily want to see this political theater. At the same time, they don't want to see, to the extent that you can prove that what happened in the Capitol on the 6th of January was directly tied to something that Donald Trump said, and that can be a very difficult legal thing to prove. In fact, I'd argue it's impossible to prove. To that extent, something has to be done. Does that kind of sum up what you're thinking?
If like stuff like that didn't take place, I feel like it would never have been
Mm-hmm.
a whole little impeachment thing, and he would have been able to run again. And he probably would have won, but like because of little stuff like that is what's making it,
Yeah. Here's a scenario someone came up with, which this would keep Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer up at night. So Donald Trump is now back in Florida, in Palm Beach County, one of the more Republican counties in the state. There's going to be an open legislative seat there in 2 years, in 2022, less than 2 years now. It's conceivable he could run for that seat. It's conceivable he could win that seat. He wouldn't be the first former president to serve in the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams did it. Andrew Johnson ran for Senate after he left office, so it could happen. So now he's in the House of Representatives. Depending on what direction the Republican Party goes, I don't think the Trump era is over because he has too many supporters. The party would be hard-pressed to just turn their backs on those people and say, we're done with you now. So let's say he becomes Speaker of the House. Could happen. And let's just say that something comes up with Hunter Biden's laptop that's really incriminating to the president. Now there's a genuine impeachment of Joe Biden. You could see a former president as Speaker of the House, initiating an impeachment action against the current president. And that's why I say this madness has gone far enough. And then, of course, he could go back and run again in 24. So who knows what craziness awaits us. But Naja, I agree with you. I think most people feel that there should be some recognition of the seriousness of what happened. Whether impeachment is that thing, I'm not sure, but I feel you. I get you. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Like I said before, I really don't know. I'm still learning, but I agree with what, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, Naisha said. I agree with that, and I mean, I don't know. I feel like you said, Trump has a lot of supporters, and who knows? I don't know. Maybe we'll see him again. I don't know.
It's interesting, and I'll leave you with this observation, kind of big picture of politics. What does this all mean for the future? The one thing that, we have someone joining us late in the day. I think this is Lindy, and there's Lindy. Hi. You missed some of the fun, but that's okay. You're here now. Regardless of whether the American people as a whole are as polarized as social media would suggest and the media would suggest, the fact of the matter is our politicians are, meaning that there really is no center anymore. It wasn't that long ago that Democrats and Republicans actually found common ground. They realized that they had to legislate, they had to compromise. They could posture and preen all they wanted at election time, but ultimately they had to figure out ways to get things done, which meant there had to be some give. There is no give anymore, literally none. The only time they've actually come together and looked united even briefly was in the direct aftermath of what happened on January 6th, when they literally were invaded by these crazy people. But that didn't last much more than a day or so. That means that if you can no longer, if you compromise, right, you're not just coming up with a practical solution, you're doing something that's betraying the cause, that's betraying your side, all right? To sit down and have common cause, let's say to have Ted Cruz sit down with Ocasio-Cortez and have common cause would probably mean supporters of both would question them. Although they do both agree on one thing, and that is term limits. It's interesting to see if they can find common ground on that. So the center has disappeared. Now, what does that mean for the parties going forward? Joe Biden is an old-fashioned centrist Democrat. I mean, he's been around since forever. I mean, there was a time when, in his political experience, sitting down with Republicans and working stuff out, that's what politics was. He can't do that anymore, because he has a very strong pull from the far left side of the party, right? The far left progressives, as they call themselves, which is going to make it very difficult for him to compromise. On the Republican side, obviously, you have, it's not so much that you've got the far right, you have the populists, because Donald Trump is not a conservative. He's a populist. It's a very different thing. But the populists are very strong in the Republican Party right now. The establishment, like Mitch McConnell and the boys, they can't just turn these people away. They can't say the Trump era is over, we wash our hands of Donald Trump, the heck with you, because there's a very real threat that a third party could become a reality. I predict that you're going to see both parties tear themselves in half these next couple of years. And that means more polarization, not less. It means you really could see potentially in the next 2 to 4 years a scenario in which the far left progressives get frustrated with Schumer and Pelosi and Biden and split and form their own party to really pursue a socialist agenda, a la Bernie Sanders. And you could see the populists on the side of the Republicans form what they are going to call the Patriot Party. They've already threatened to do it. Now you could go from a stable, relatively stable two-party system with a binary choice to a four-party system. And these parties wouldn't be spoilers as they've been in the past. They would actually have some clout. So we could really be on the threshold of rewriting the history of how politics works in this country. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. But as I said to my classes in the past, you guys are going to be the ones that have to figure it out, because I'm going to be gone soon. So it's up to you. Okay. And that's basically what I brought to the table. Any questions, concerns, statements of ideological conviction, anything you want to clear up or share about anything, whether it's the stuff we talked about today or the course itself or anything.
I think I'm okay for right now.
Okay. I know some of you have expressed concern about deadlines and dates, and I know it's a little bit vague because there really aren't. I mean, I have material separated according to week, right? One of the few advantages of being in an asynchronous course is you can, to a certain extent, work at your own pace, right? So I'm not sitting there with my watch saying, "Oh, it's 11:59 on a Sunday night, and I didn't get something from X," right? So I'm not going to play that game. So you've got some flexibility. My only wisdom is don't get too far behind and don't pull too far ahead because then you're out of sync with the rest of the class. Other than that, I'd have to say I've actually been pretty impressed with the submissions I've seen so far. I appreciate it. I definitely appreciate you guys making the time to join today. And we'll schedule other ones. I'm not going to do it once a week, but I'll schedule them as I think they're necessary, or as I think they can add some insight into what's going on in the country. And I encourage you to come back, and if you know anybody else in the class, encourage them to join. I know it's not mandatory, and I know some people have work and conflicts, but this is an opportunity to really benefit from this class in the way that you should be able to benefit from it, where you get to test out ideas and you get to engage in dialogue with your colleagues and with me. And that goes way beyond any of the stuff that's on a screen. So with that, thank you for coming. And I'll see you online, and we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.
Cool.
All right, thanks, everybody.
You're welcome.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice day.